If you've got any money, I'll pay you double," mocked the manager, until he discovered the unexpected. In the heart of Texas, a humble rancher walked into a luxury bank just to make a transfer. What seemed like an ordinary day quickly turned into a public humiliation when the manager ridiculed him in front of everyone. But no one could have imagined who that man really was. And the revelation would change the fate of the entire branch forever. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Dallas sun was still blazing high when William Carter parked his pickup in front of the mirrored glass building. He had driven straight from the ranch without changing clothes. There was no time to waste. Earlier that morning, he had overseen the birth of 2 calves, given the ranch hands instructions on feeding the herd, and checked on repairs to a broken stretch of fencing. Dry dust clung to his well-worn plaid shirt. His boots carried hardened mud from the corral, and his weathered straw hat still held the scent of the sun. Tall and broad-shouldered, William didn't seem the least bit concerned with the stark contrast between his appearance and the polished environment waiting for him. The cheap watch on his wrist ticked away against the rush of the day, but his expression stayed calm. For him, it was just another task, and a long list of responsibilities dot the inside of the bank branch was an immediate contrast. The marble floor gleamed under cool white lights. Leather sofas were arranged with precise symmetry, and modern art hung neatly on the walls. William pushed through the revolving door and instantly felt the shift in temperature, the chill of the air conditioning cutting against the lingering heat of his work outdoors. The hushed decorum of the space was broken only by the sound of his heavy boots striking the marble, drawing every eye toward him. Men in suits looked up with suspicion. Women edged back a step, clutching their designer handbags. The contrast between the rancher and the sterile setting grew sharper when low whispers rippled through the room, audible enough to sting. He walked on without hurrying. William's gaze was fixed on the telecounter, ignoring the stares of disapproval around him. A receptionist, her smile trained and automatic, glanced up for only a second before returning to her keyboard as if he were invisible. An executive in a blue suit leaned toward a colleague, whispering something that drew a muffled laugh. The air conditioning kept the room cold, but it couldn't cool the discomfort spreading among the clients. Every step William took seemed to weigh down the atmosphere, thickening the silence. He adjusted his hat, drew in a deep breath, and kept a steady pace, the same way he would crossing the wide pastures. He wasn't there to impress anyone, just to take care of business. When he reached the counter, he set his calloused hands on the glass surface. They were hands marked by ropes, reins, and tools. The hands of a man who had spent decades working under open skies. The teller took a few seconds before lifting his eyes, clearly annoyed. When he finally did, he met a steady gaze, shaded by the brim of William's hat. William slowly removed it, revealing short gray hair and a weathered face, calm but firm. The contrast between him and the setting only widened in that instant. That counter had seen businessmen, politicians, and entrepreneurs, but rarely anyone who looked like William. "Good afternoon," he said in a deep, steady voice, breaking the silence that had settled around him. The words carried across the lobby as though they had interrupted an unshakable routine. A few customers leaned in, curious about what was happening. The teller cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and began typing slowly on his computer, unable to hide his unease. The dry click of the keys sounded louder than it should have, each keystroke measuring the 10 seconds. William stood still, unhurried, showing no hint of nervousness. He simply waited. His composure stood in stark contrast to the tension building among the staff and clients. There stood William Carter, a rancher used to long days and hard work, now before a polished counter in the heart of Dallas's financial district. Nothing in his demeanor suggested unease. He wasn't bothered by the curious glances or the whispers. He just stood there, patient, the same way he had often waited back on the ranch for the rain to fall or the cattle to settle. The branch remained quiet, filled only with the hum of the air conditioning and the faint trace of mud drying on his boots. The difference between him and that world was obvious to everyone present, but for William, it didn't matter. He was there as a customer, expecting to be treated as one. Richard Collins, the branch manager, watched everything from behind the glass walls of his office. At 38, he took pride in both his position and the image he projected. He wore tailored suits, Italian shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a Swiss watch on his wrist as a personal trophy. To him, the bank was a stage, and every client an opportunity to reinforce his status. When he noticed William Carter walking up to the counter, dust still clinging to his shirt, boots caked with mud, and a worn-out hat on his head, Richard's lips curled into a sneer. The contrast between this rancher and the suited executives in the lobby struck him as almost laughable. He opened his office door slowly, measuring each step, and walked toward the scene, ready to prove who was in charge. Richard's approach didn't go unnoticed. Customers familiar with his sharp tone sensed something was about to happen. He moved with his chin raised, posture stiff, radiating a false confidence that impressed the some but barely concealed his enjoyment in belittling others. William stood calmly at the counter, but the eyes around him shifted. Some whispered to one another, others chuckled quietly, anticipating a spectacle. For Richard, this was routine, turning clients who didn't fit the mold into public examples of how not to behave in his domain. Stopping in front of William, he tilted his head slightly and flashed a practiced, insincere smile. "May I help you, sir? Looking for the small payments desk?" The irony in his tone was unmistakable. William simply looked up, his calm as steady as when he faced a storm on the ranch. He removed his hat again out of respect and answered in an even voice. "I need to make a transfer." The straightforward reply didn't match Richard's expectations. The manager raised his eyebrows and folded his arms. Of course. And how much are we talking about?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, as though he were speaking to a lost child. The answer came firm and clear. $20 million. The entire room froze. The teller's keyboard fell silent. Conversation stopped, and even the security guard by the door straightened in disbelief. The silence that followed was almost tangible, as though everyone waited for a punchline to confirm it was just a joke. Richard blinked several times, unsure he'd heard correctly. Then a loud laugh burst from his chest, echoing across the lobby. "20 million?" he repeated, making sure everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, our rancher friend here thinks he can transfer 20 million. Nearby customers started laughing, some quietly, others openly, caught up in the mockery. A receptionist turned her face away, trying to hide her smile but failing to disguise the gleam of scorn in her eyes. William stood unmoved, holding his hat in his hands, watching silently as the reaction spread. The scene was quickly turning into a performance, and Richard seemed to relish every second of the public humiliation. For him, tearing someone down who didn't belong was practically a sport. As the laughter rippled through the room, Richard leaned back toward William, his arrogance unchecked. "Are you sure you didn't slip a 0 or 2? Maybe you meant 2,000? Or perhaps 10? His sarcasm was thick, his voice laced with malice. William didn't budge. He kept his gaze steady on the manager, his tone steady. "No, son. 20 million. You can check the account." The simple, confident reply made some chuckles break into awkward coughs, but Richard pressed on. Pretending exaggerated surprise, he threw his hands up dramatically and looked around, inviting the whole lobby to join in his ridicule. It was as if he wanted to turn the moment into a public lesson that certain people didn't belong in that space. The branch, once buzzing with quick conversations, was now fully focused on the standoff. The echo of William's boots on the marble still seemed to linger even after he'd stopped in front of the manager. Some clients exchanged approving glances with Richard, reinforcing the atmosphere of exclusion. Others, more cautious, watched with a mix of curiosity and unease, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. A young employee, Sarah Mitchell, watched from a distance, her expression uneasy, as though she wasn't comfortable with the way the manager was handling things. But no one spoke up. Richard's power in the branch was too great, and everyone knew that challenging him could come at a cost. In the middle of the spectacle, William remained calm, motionless, waiting patiently for someone to finally do the job he had come for. The bank lobby seemed to shrink as Richard Collins tightened his grip on the scene. He circled near the counter, drawing curious and approving looks from the customers. The teller who had started the paperwork stepped back, preferring not to get involved. Richard seized the moment to turn every word into theater, as if he were on stage. He pointed at William, looked around the room, and gestured with exaggerated flair. 20 million, ladies and gentlemen. Our friend here says he wants to transfer 20 million. His voice bounced off the marble walls, pulling muffled laughter from a few executives. Women in heels exchanged knowing glances, amused by what they saw as an absurd claim. Richard felt at ease, even euphoric, soaking in the attention. To him, nothing was more satisfying than putting someone in their place in public, especially someone who looked so out of place in that environment. Richard then ordered the receptionist to bring a stack of forms. Sarah Mitchell, watching from her desk, hesitated for a moment but followed his instructions. He spread the papers across the counter with a loud slap, as though they were irrefutable proof of William's incompetence. For a transaction of this size, we'll need proof of funds, 5 years of tax returns, and prior approval from our private banking division, he announced, flipping through the papers as if they were playing cards. With each form, his voice grew more sarcastic. This isn't a cattle market, Mr. Carter. This is a serious bank. Customers who had been standing farther away moved closer, forming a small circle of spectators. The chill of the air conditioning could no longer mask the heavy atmosphere. William, however, stood steady, his hat resting in his hands, his eyes fixed directly on the manager. Sarah tried to intervene discreetly, stepping closer to the counter. Mr. Collins, maybe we should at least check the account history before exposing the client like this, she whispered, almost pleading. Richard cut her off immediately, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Miss Mitchell, stick to your duties. If this man really had that kind of money, he'd already be familiar with the protocols. Laughter followed his words, spreading through some of the onlookers. A security guard, arms crossed, stayed alert, as if waiting for the order to escort William out. The rancher breathed deeply but didn't move, radiating a calm that clashed with Richard's theatrics. The customers were split. Some laughed openly, while others simply watched, curious about where it would all lead. Sensing he had everyone's full attention, Richard decided to crown his performance with a line that would etch his arrogance into the moment. He planted one hand on the counter and leaned toward William, a malicious smile spreading across his face. If you've got any money, I'll pay you double. The lobby erupted in laughter, as if it were the best joke of the day. An executive nearly spilled his coffee from laughing so hard. Sarah stepped back, ashamed of the cruelty in the remark. The security guard allowed himself a smug grin, as though he had just witnessed a personal victory. Richard raised his hands theatrically, as if he had just wrapped up a comedy show. Yet William didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, his face unmoved. There was no anger, no submission, only a quiet patience that unsettled those who had expected to see him humiliated. The cruel line reverberated through the room like a sentence. A few customers stepped closer, eager to witness the conclusion of the scene. The collective laughter created an atmosphere of condescension that reinforced the invisible hierarchy of the space. The suited elite at the top, the outliers reduced to a joke. Sarah, unable to bear the second-hand shame, lowered her eyes to the floor, silently wishing someone would intervene. Richard, however, seemed to savor every second, reveling in what he saw as a personal triumph. He paced back and forth, speaking loudly about internal policies and bank security, but in truth, he was only prolonging the show. William remained where he stood, hands firmly gripping his hat, his breathing steady, embodying the calm of a man who refused to bend to a hostile crowd. As Richard pushed his performance further, the mood inside the bank began to shift. The laughter started to fade, replaced by a strange tension. Some customers, who had been complicit moments earlier, no longer laughed so easily. There was something about William's posture that defied ridicule. His unshakable calm, steady gaze, and quiet dignity created a contrast too sharp to ignore against the manager's bluster. Sarah noticed it before anyone else. Richard's arrogance could fill the room with noise and gestures, but it couldn't erase the presence of the man before him. William stood firm, enduring each taunt without losing his composure. And that detail, still invisible to many, was slowly eroding the absolute control the manager thought he had over the situation. Laughter was still echoing through the lobby when Richard Collins felt his phone buzz in the inside pocket of his suit. Still savoring his mockery, he answered, but his expression shifted instantly when he saw the name on the screen: Charles Bennett, the regional director. He straightened up quickly, cleared his throat, and tried to adjust his tone. "Hello, Mr. Bennett. Good morning." The reply came sharp and direct. "Richard, is there a client named William Carter at your branch right now?" The manager glanced sideways at William, still standing calmly at the counter, and answered with barely hidden irony. "Yes, sir. A rancher who insists on transferring millions without a shred of proof." Silence hung for a few seconds on the other end before the director's voice cut through, firm and unquestionable. "Put him on the phone immediately, and treat him with the utmost respect." The room, still filled with laughter a moment ago, began to fall quiet. A chill ran down Richard's body. The hand holding the phone trembled, though he tried to hide it. "Mr. Bennett, with all due respect, this man doesn't look like..." Before he could finish, the director's voice thundered with authority. "Don't make me repeat myself, Collins. Hand the phone to Mr. Carter now." The command was loud enough that several people nearby heard it. The whispers stopped, and every eye followed the manager's next move. Flushed with shame, Richard walked slowly toward William and extended the phone with trembling hands. "Mr. Carter, the director would like to speak with you." The rancher took the phone calmly, as if it were just another routine conversation. His natural composure only intensified the tension in the room. "Charles, my friend, how are you?" William said in a steady tone, greeting the director by name, stunning both clients and employees who were listening in. The silence was absolute. He continued, "I'm here trying to make a transfer, but it seems they've come up with some new protocols I wasn't aware of. Maybe you could clarify that for me." His words were firm but never raised. A few employees exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that such familiarity could mean only one thing. William was no ordinary customer. Sarah Mitchell, watching closely, felt her heartbeat quicken. She had defended this man minutes earlier without knowing who he really was. And now she realized she was standing before someone far beyond what anyone had imagined. As William spoke with the director, Richard struggled to keep his composure. He ran a hand through his hair, straightened his tie, and avoided the accusing stares of customers who had laughed alongside him just moments earlier. The silence in the lobby was broken only by William's firm voice as he continued. "No, there's no need for you to come down here, Charles. We can resolve this simply. I trust you to straighten it out with your team." His words carried like an indirect lesson to the manager and everyone else present. The director replied respectfully, promising to take care of the matter immediately. William thanked him and handed the phone back to the manager with the same calmness he had shown when receiving it. The difference now was clear. Everyone knew this man was far more than a hurried rancher. Richard forced an awkward smile, but the redness in his face betrayed his panic. The manager, who only minutes earlier had flaunted his authority, now looked small before the client who spoke to the regional director like an old acquaintance. Customers who had joined in the laughter lowered their eyes, embarrassed by their complicity. A few employees shrank back, hoping not to be reminded of their own smug chuckles. The security guard by the door pretended to answer a call on his radio, edging away discreetly. The power Richard thought he commanded had shifted completely, without William lifting a finger. The rancher stood tall, adjusted his hat, and waited silently for the next step. The atmosphere in the lobby had turned upside down. Where mockery and superiority had reigned, tension and uncertainty now settled. No one knew exactly who William Carter was, but everyone was sure he represented far more than appearances suggested. The receptionist who had laughed earlier swallowed hard and ducked behind her computer screen. Sarah, in contrast, kept her eyes fixed on William, as though trying to understand the calm strength he carried. The manager, shrinking into his own humiliation, fumbled for words to regain control, but nothing came. The man they had all judged at first glance was no longer seen the same way. The silence that hung in the air was proof that something fundamental had shifted forever. William took a deep breath before slipping his hand into the pocket of his plaid shirt. From it, he pulled out a tablet with a plain cover, its screen protector scratched from heavy use, standing in stark contrast to the sleek, expensive devices carried by the executives around him. He powered it on calmly, scrolling through digital folders until he found what he wanted. The movement stirred murmurs. Some customers leaned forward to get a better look, while others stepped back, as if sensing something monumental was about to happen. The rancher set the tablet on the counter and turned it for all to see. On the screen appeared official documents, digital certificates, audited reports. Every scanned page bore stamps and signatures confirming its authenticity. "My name is William Carter," he said in a steady, measured voice. "And here is the proof of my position as the majority shareholder of this bank." The shock was immediate. Richard Collins's eyes widened, his face drained of all color. The laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier now seemed like a crime committed in public. He stammered, desperate to deny the obvious. "This must be a mistake. You can't possibly." But his words trailed off when Sarah Mitchell, still stunned, stepped closer to examine the screen. "It's true," she whispered, almost to herself. The manager stumbled back a step, unable to hold William's gaze. Customers who had found the whole scene amusing began whispering nervously. No one wanted to remember they had taken part in a humiliation that was now revealed as a collective disgrace. William, however, didn't raise his voice. He stood firm, radiating the quiet strength of a man who had always known exactly where he belonged. For more than 20 years, I've trusted this bank with my money and my history, William continued, swiping across the screen to reveal multi-million-dollar statements, transfers, and long-standing investments. And I've always expected that every client, no matter who they were, would be treated with the dignity they deserve. The silence in the room was heavy, as if everyone were standing before an invisible court. Richard tried to recover his breath, reaching for an excuse. "Mr. Carter, I didn't know." But William interrupted him without raising his voice. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. And because you believed appearances mattered more than character." The words cut through the room like a blade. Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tight with pride for having defended him without knowing who he truly was. A few clients, unable to face their own part in the mockery, quietly gathered their belongings and slipped out. But most stayed, captivated by the weight of what was unfolding before them. The security guard by the door lowered his head, recalling the harsh words he had spoken earlier. The receptionist who had whispered her derision bit her lip to keep back tears of regret. William continued scrolling through the reports, but he no longer needed them. It was enough to see his calm face, his simple clothes, and the striking contrast between genuine humility and exposed arrogance to understand who truly held power in that room. Every second that passed deepened Richard's discomfort, sweat trickling as he stood trapped between humiliation and the fear of losing everything. Then William lifted his eyes and looked directly at the manager. His tone wasn't angry, it was disappointed. "You told me that if I had any money, you'd pay me double. Well, here's the proof that I've never lacked money. What has always been missing is respect." The words reverberated through the lobby, heavy as a verdict. No one dared laugh, no one dared applaud. The silence was absolute. Richard covered his face with one hand, trying to hide his expression of defeat. He knew the very phrase he had once used as mockery had now become the sentence that sealed his downfall. Sarah shivered, realizing she had just witnessed a moment that would mark the history of that branch. William calmly picked up the tablet and slipped it back into his shirt pocket. Then he adjusted his hat and let his eyes sweep across the room, meeting each gaze in turn. There was no triumph in his posture, only firmness. "This bank was built to serve everyone, not to humiliate some," he said, his words carrying not only to those present but to the very future of the institution. The branch seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his voice. Wealthy clients, employees used to enforcing distance, all of them stood with their heads lowered. Sarah breathed deeply, fully aware that the man before her had just delivered a lesson no one would ever forget. And Richard Collins, defeated in his own arena, knew that his career, once propped up by arrogance, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. William stood at the center of the branch, unhurried, letting his gaze pass over every face that had judged him moments earlier and now struggled to find a place to hide. The lobby, normally filled with the cold rhythm of lines, ticket numbers, and hurried voices, was suspended in a silence heavier than any word. He adjusted his hat with the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone and said, "A bank only exists because people trust it. If that trust is broken, no amount of money can hold its walls up." His tone wasn't a sermon, but a reminder of something everyone knew yet had forgotten. Clients in sharp suits and high heels lowered their heads, feeling the weight of those words. The manager, already defeated, was gone, but the shadow of his arrogance still lingered among those who remained. Sarah, still near the counter, listened to every syllable as though she were being handed lessons for life. He turned first to the employees, who shrank back between desks and computer screens. "You don't just handle accounts or forms," he continued with steady firmness. "You deal with stories. Every client who walks through these doors brings with them a lifetime of work, choices, and sacrifices. If you fail to see that, it doesn't matter how many degrees you hold or how many targets you hit, your work loses its meaning." His words echoed into every corner, weighing heavily on young receptionists, on analysts in stiff suits, on security guards trained to measure people by their clothing. The receptionist who had laughed minutes earlier raised her eyes timidly, guilt burning deeper than any reprimand. The intern felt shame, but also a flicker of hope. There was still time to learn and change. William then turned his gaze to Sarah. The look made her catch her breath, afraid she might be dismissed along with the others. But what followed left her speechless. "Miss Mitchell, your actions showed character when everyone else stayed silent. And character is what we need most here. Starting today, you will take over as manager of this branch." The surprise hit her like a jolt. Her legs trembled, but she stood tall, fully aware of the responsibility that had just been placed on her shoulders. "I don't expect perfection from you," William added. but I expect commitment. I want every person who walks through these doors to feel they've been treated with dignity." Colleagues nearby exchanged looks, some ashamed of their earlier laughter, others genuinely ready to support their new leader. Sarah drew a deep breath, taking in the weight of the mission now before her. William then addressed the clients still standing, witnesses to something they never imagined they would see. "Today, many of you learned a lesson. Appearance does not define character, and arrogance does not define power. Respect is not a prize you grant to those with more money. It is an obligation you owe to every person." His words weren't just for the employees, but also for those who had considered themselves superior and had laughed minutes earlier at the same scene. Some averted their eyes, others sighed with shame, and a few nodded silently as though admitting their failure. The heavy air slowly began to clear, replaced by a sense that something greater was taking root in that place. In just a matter of minutes, the branch was no longer the same. He adjusted his hat, stepped toward the exit, and left one final message behind. Money is only a tool. It can build or destroy, but it is the people who manage it who decide which. Let this bank choose every single day to build, not to push away those who trust it. There was no harshness in his voice, only conviction. It was the voice of someone who understood the true value of things, someone who knew the price of every grain harvested, every calf raised, every sleepless night spent working to reach his goals. Sarah felt a knot rise in her throat. She knew this wasn't just a parting speech. It was a call to transform every detail of how they would work from then on. The clients who still lingered followed the moment in silence, not daring to interrupt. Outside, the sun blazed against the concrete as William stepped through the door. He breathed deeply, walked to his truck, and opened the door with the same natural ease with which he had arrived. He didn't look back, he didn't need to. He knew that inside those walls, one chapter had closed and another had begun. Sarah was already moving, gathering colleagues, reshuffling papers, and resuming service. Ordinary clients were greeted with gestures of courtesy they had never experienced before. The man who had entered as a rushed rancher now walked away, revealed as the shareholder who had changed everything, without shouting, without ostentation, only with firmness and truth. As he turned the key in the ignition and heard the engine roar to life, William allowed himself a faint smile. The bank would go on, but with a new soul. And he returned to what he had always been, a man of the land who knew that respect was the greatest wealth of all. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.